Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Talking about a federal army is pointless, said Poland's foreign minister of Sikorski in Brussels recently. But could a smaller European legion, which he floated, financed by the EU and politically accountable to a political and security committee, provide real security in North Africa, the Balkans, or even Ukraine? Beatrice Heuser, Senior Associate Fellow at the University of Glasgow, joins us now to weigh in on those questions. Good to have you on the program. Welcome.
Good morning.
So we have various ideas and certain choices ahead. So I'm just wondering, this legion that Mr. Sikorski has suggested, some others have said a full EU army. I mean, given constraints on many, many levels, how realistic can the EU be in creating an autonomous military force?
Making something fairly small is not a problem at all. You already have the Franco-German brigade, which is about 5,000 people. And I understand that this is the sort of size that a Polish government is now talking about. But that already exists. One could multiply that. The problem to me seems to be how to make all of this coherent, how to bring this all together. So I have a lot of sympathy for the proposal of Andrius Kubilius, the Commissioner for Defense, to say that you want something larger, something the size of what currently are American forces in Europe. So that would be 85,000 people. I understand his proposal is 100,000 people. I don't think the problem lies there. The problem is the one of who decides how to use it.
Indeed. So on that, on the use and the mandate, I think those structures, you mentioned coherency as well, but then also a bit of dissonance in terms of what the European institutions say. You mentioned Kubilius, that's the Commissioner for Defense and Space, that 100,000 army. But at the same time, if you look at Kaja Kallas, who's the head diplomat, has basically countered that recently, has said, well, this blurs the picture, complicates NATO. So even the Commission is sending different signals. So where is this headed, really?
Yes, I find that very deplorable that there is more coherence between the two of them. One theory that I have heard is that there is a little tweedledum, tweedledee play that goes on between different commissioners. When one proposes something quite extreme, another one will say, well, here is a more modest proposal. I don't think that's very useful. I think the real problem is, as I said, the one of command and control. And that's why I think this whole proposal or this whole debate should be seen in the context also of proposing a European Council for Defense or something like that, because that is really where you have to start with the whole thing. Who would decide how to use this? Who would decide on the strategy? That's where you have to start. You can go back in history and discuss why this didn't happen in the past.
Yeah, but I think also critics will point that this goes above and beyond what the European Union is allowed to do. It goes beyond a certain mandate. But then I also want to ask you, if we can, about the common foreign and security policy. Now, before we get too much into bureaucracy, but this comes from an article, I believe it's Article 42 in the European treaties. So there's also mutual defense in there. So could this be, let's say, the framework of this, or is this a stumbling block? Tell us a bit more about that.
Absolutely. The Lisbon Treaty has this article that you already mentioned, the Article 42.7, which is one of a total, unconditional commitment to mutual defense, which is infinitely more sophisticated, well, more explicit than NATO's Article 5, which simply leaves it up to the individual governments to decide what they're going to do if one member state is attacked. So 42.7 is utterly unconditional and total commitment to the defense of everybody else. So in theory, there should be something to follow that. And what de facto has happened also with the Lisbon Treaty is that the European Union has left the implementation of this mainly to NATO, particularly for everything to do with larger scale operations. But if I may just step back and say the whole problem around having a joint European defense and actually acting on it, it goes back to an eternal tension between the defense of sovereignty of individual states and the question to which they are willing to cede some of that sovereignty to a supranational level. And this is why this proposal for a European Defence Council is so important, because it is one way of looking at how you might be able to balance the two, having some sort of joint decision-making, but probably only among a few member states of the European Union, not the entire 27.
Yeah, because I mean, ultimately, also going back to the treaties, that mutual defense clause actually doesn't explicitly say it must be military. It must be at the means and discretion of a member state. So countries like Ireland or Austria might not necessarily have to fulfill it militarily.
I see what you mean. Some countries, there's the clause that says countries concerned can do it their own way. But for the great majority, it is total commitment of all means at their disposal. So all means at their disposal would include, for example, French nuclear weapons. So in a way, it's a clause that says you can't stop. You can't simply say, oh, we've done enough now, if you haven't succeeded in defending your fellow member. So it really says go all the way to the very end to do everything within your capacity to defend another member state. So it is total. It's including military. You might be able to do things with just economic means, but if you can't succeed with that, it is military as well.
But also on the, let's say, the counter argument here, someone might say, well, look, I mean, if we look at member states of the European Union, 23 out of 27 are already member states of NATO. That NATO is going to be in charge of that, the military command structure is already there, that having now this parallel new force, I mean, there's so many questions. Also, I mean, let's face it, Europe doesn't do things fast. The European institutions are not known for their speed in terms of decision. So how do we counter that argument, if at all?
We counter that argument by saying that the cooperation between NATO and the European Union since the 1990s is actually stuck in a dead end. The dead end comes from the fact that there are some members of NATO that are not members of the European Union and vice versa. And particularly a couple of the member states of NATO that in the European Union keep blocking this cooperation, simply make it impossible. So we haven't really moved very much on the situation that we were in the 1990s, when first we tried to coordinate the cooperation between the two. And so basically, it's a dead end. We have to intervene as well. And also with the United Kingdom being outside the European Union and the need to cooperate with the United Kingdom because it is a power that matters, that actually has military capacity, that is willing to use it, unlike some countries. Some sort of new cooperation mechanism is necessary. And this idea of having a European Council that would decide this with a very small number of states that actually jointly make a decision rather than bringing in the 27 who can never come to an agreement, as you just said. It's basically, it takes so long for them to agree on anything. And it can also be blocked by individual member states within that because the European Union does not like qualified majority voting. Really means that you have to have a new start. And there have been a number of ideas circulating of how that could be achieved, by the European Union or NATO even breaking up into regional, sub-regional institutions. But this one would be one that could salvage as much as possible of the Union itself and the cooperation within the Union. But really a new start is necessary. And therefore, having only about 5 or 6 countries around the 5 countries plus a representative of the European Union would be a way to facilitate this.
And what about the argument that, probably even just some months ago, there have been voices that said, well, we don't need this. This is something that doesn't make necessarily that much strategic sense. How much have the recent events, in particular the Greenland incident, let's say, made this more of an imperative? Has this strengthened this cause to wean away from the United States?
Yes, I think even since the first Trump presidency, European countries have been in denial. We all want to have the US backing us. We all want to have this nice, solid NATO to fall back on. And already during the first Trump presidency, there were many people who said, look, this is really, really problematic. It doesn't look as though NATO was going to be as solid in future as it has been in the past. Now, under the second Trump presidency, more and more countries and more political leaders have come out of that space of denial, where they simply said, I wish it were otherwise, therefore I shall close my eyes to the reality. I think NATO has to undergo very, very deep structural reforms. The question is there also, again, whether some countries are going to make it impossible for those reforms to take place because NATO operates by consensus. So in the meantime, let NATO try to reform itself and to really have a proper functioning European pillar. But while awaiting for that to happen, we might as well get on with it and try something else and try to find a new form of decision-making among the leading members of the European Union as an alliance of the willing, but see what they can do and see how they can bring forces together that are substantial and can actually affect something, and how these can be coordinated and made efficient and effective in their coordination and their standardization and their joint procedures.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to come back to the suggestion by Mr. Sikorski, the Foreign Minister of Poland, in this legion he talked about. And he also, in that same proposal, I think he's envisaged that also candidate countries could also contribute. I suppose this would include someone like even maybe Ukraine, maybe Moldova. In your mind, is this a challenge? Is this an opportunity? Is this a complication if that does go ahead?
I think it's a great opportunity, and we also should not forget Canada. Canada has also been a staunch ally, a very reliable ally, and we mustn't think of it exclusively as something that would only be for European countries. I think we have to be innovative in our thinking. What we have to keep in mind is that there will be there'll be a continuing tension between sovereign use of armed forces. But countries will want to retain the right to take their own armed forces out of such a union and to either not allow them to be used or to use them differently, and the idea of a proper integration. But the more the integrated forces, or the more the forces that are made available, whether it is to a legion, perhaps a large legion, or indeed to a force of 100,000, as Andreas Kubilius has suggested, the more coherent they are, the more standardized they are, the more they have been trained together, they are operational, they can all work in, it's going to be English, it's clear, whatever you do, it's going to be in English, and the more you can achieve on the day. And as long as you don't have a proper European federal state, of course, you can never really make this force as coherent as, say, the Americans are under just one political leadership. But the more you do try to standardize them and to bring them together, the more effective they're going to be, possibly also in contexts where they have to be used elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, and on that note, I want to know, used elsewhere in the world, I mean, if this force would come together on territory of the European Union, that's one thing, if it does come to that. But then operationally, if we're looking at its deployment, if we're where could you foresee that? Also, looking at certain types of international peacekeeping forces, if we're looking at the United Nations, that has not always been a success. If we're looking if they're under fire, what happened in Bosnia, if we're looking at Rwanda, those are not positive cases in that regard. That command and control, the execution, how do you see that operationally play out?
Bosnia and the Yugoslav wars were a very sore point in question, simply because you had small, different deployments of different forces, all with their own terms of reference, all with their own ways of engaging, and that made them very heterogeneous and not a very good tool to use. I think everybody's mind is now still focused on how European forces could be used in Ukraine to support an armistice there and to give Ukraine the security during a phase of armistice, which might really last for quite a long time. So when I'm saying elsewhere in the world, that would be the primary idea that everybody probably have coming to mind. Precisely there, the need is there to have common terms of reference, to have common modus operandi, and to have as much standardization of their equipment as possible. All these things really should be coming together.
Mm-hmm. All right. Look, interesting stuff, and I think a layered approach, so many different facets to understand. But look, a really interesting case there for us today. Much appreciated. That was our guest, Beatrice Heuser, there, Senior Associate Fellow at the University of Glasgow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.